Good afternoon and welcome. I am Michael Kessler, Assistant Director of the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs here at Georgetown, where I'm a faculty member in the Department of Government. On behalf of the Berkley Center, I would like to welcome you to this afternoon's program on new challenges for the White House Office of Faith-Based Neighborhood Partnerships. The Berkley Center has emerged as a leader in the interdisciplinary study of religion and its role in world affairs. Through research, teaching, and outreach activities, as well as events such as today's, the Berkley Center builds knowledge, promotes dialogue, and supports action in the service of peace. Our program on religion, politics, and law, which is sponsoring today's event and which I lead, engages issues about the future of political theologies and the global intersection of law and religion. The program this afternoon, in my mind, is timely for many reasons. As we race through the first 100 days of a new presidency, many questions linger about an office created in the prior administration, which achieved many good things and was confronted with many controversies. President Obama signaled strong support for the office during the campaign, saying, "I still believe it's a good idea to have a partnership between the White House and grassroots groups, both faith-based and secular. Yet partnerships between religious organizations and government can entangle these realms in ways that may be mutually harmful. The old challenges still lay ahead, particularly the thorny issue of whether religious organizations who take federal funds should be able to take religion into account when hiring employees. At the same time, tremendous opportunities exist for the office to help carry out tasks central to the government's plan for economic stabilization and recovery. Religious and community groups, as we know, will not stand idly by while their neighbors suffer during these hard times. These groups are the de facto safety net for millions. The Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships could be a critical leader for these groups, both by mobilizing funding and also by providing moral and logistical leadership, information, and best practices. The office, led by a president who has already proven himself to be the community organizer-in-chief, could mobilize churches, mosques, and synagogues together with local Kiwanis, Girl Scouts, and Lions clubs and call them into service to help needy people ensure that their basic needs are met. He could use the office to unite all nonprofits, as well as religious groups, in the common task of working for the benefit of others. It is now my pleasure to welcome the participants in this afternoon's discussion. E.J. Dionne, Chip Lupu, Stanley Carlson-Thies, and Melissa Rogers, who will explore some of these issues in the next 75 to 80 minutes. E.J. Dionne writes a column for the Washington Post, which is also nationally syndicated in over 90 outlets. Besides a famous columnist, he is also an accomplished scholar of religion and politics. He is a university professor in the Foundations of Democracy and Culture at Georgetown, serving in the Georgetown Public Policy Institute and the Department of Government, and he is also a senior fellow in the Government Studies program at the Brookings Institution. E.J.'s book, Why Americans Hate Politics, won the LA Times Book Prize and was the National Book Award nominee. He is also author of They Only Look Dead, Why Progressives Still Will Dominate the Next Political Era, Stand Up, Fight Back, Republican Toughs, Democratic Wimps, and the Politics of Revenge, and Sold Out, Reclaiming Faith in Politics After the Religious Right. Chip Lupu is the F. Elwood and Eleanor Davis Professor of Law at the George Washington University Law School, where he has been a faculty member since 1990. Professor Lupu holds a BA from Cornell and a JD from Harvard Law School. After practicing law in Boston, he joined the law faculty at Boston University, where he taught from 1973 to 1989. From 1989 to 1990, he was the professor in residence on the appellate staff of the Civil Division of the United States Department of Justice. Chip is a nationally recognized scholar in constitutional law with an emphasis in his writings on the religion clauses of the First Amendment. Along with his colleague Robert Tuttle, he was, from 2001 to 2008, the co-director of legal analysis for the Roundtable on Religion and Social Welfare Policy, which sponsored research and reports on the state of the law relevant to the faith-based initiative. Stanley Carlson-Thies is president of the Institutional Religious Freedom Alliance, a Washington, D.C. area think tank that works to safeguard the religious identity and faith-shaped standards and services of faith-based service organizations. He served for many years as Director of Social Policy Studies at the Center for Public Justice. He served in the White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives in 2001 to 2002, and assisted with writing Unlevel Playing Field: Barriers to Participation by Faith-Based and Community Organizations in Federal Social Service Programs, August 2001. Carlson-Thies consults widely with federal and state agencies and with faith-based organizations. His publications include, with Carl Esbeck and Ron Sider, The Freedom of Faith-Based Organizations to Staff on a Religious Basis. Melissa Rogers serves as the director of the Wake Forest University School of Divinity Center for Religion and Public Affairs. She also teaches courses on church-state relations and Christianity and public policy within the Wake Forest Divinity School. Rogers previously served as the executive director of the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life here in Washington. Previous to her leadership at the Pew Forum, Rogers served as general counsel of the Baptist Joint Committee on Public Affairs, based in Washington. In 2004, Rogers was recognized by National Journal as one of the church-state experts politicians will call on when they get serious about addressing an important public policy issue. Rogers has co-authored a casebook on religion and law for Baylor University Press called Religious Freedom and the Supreme Court. She has testified before the Judiciary Committee to the U.S. Senate. She earned her law degree from the University of Pennsylvania Law School and graduated from Baylor University. A quick word about format. Each of the panelists have been asked to speak for about 10 minutes, and then we will engage in a conversation for another 20 minutes or so, at which time I will open it for questions from the audience, unless E.J., who has a tendency to want to get to the audience questions early, overrides my authority as moderator. It's happened a few times. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our panelists, beginning with E.J. Dionne.
Thank you very much. I'm at a Catholic university, and so I will respect authority. And so, I urge you to put your hands up early. I want to thank Michael, who's done some really extraordinary work here with the Berkley Center, and for calling you all together. What a great group! And everybody on this panel has been important to me in some way. I can't tell you the number of meetings I've been at where, when somebody has a complicated legal question on these topics, they say, call Chip. It's almost like clear it with Sidney, that line about Franklin Roosevelt and Sidney Hillman. It was, well, see what Chip thinks. And Stanley has been incredibly helpful. Melissa and I, as some of you may know, did a long report on what the next president, meaning this president, should do about faith-based initiatives. And Melissa and I on the one hand and Stanley on the other don't always agree on everything, but he was incredibly helpful, collegial, and is just a very smart person, and I'm grateful for his work. And then lastly, I've worked with Melissa on a lot of projects for a long time. I know if I'm working on a project with Melissa, I'm doing the right thing. The rest of my life, I'm not so sure of. But if you ever get sued on a church-state matter or want to sue someone, hire Chip and Melissa, and you will have the best legal team in Washington. I also want to honor Steve Monsma, who joins us, and I just learned today Steve is a Georgetown graduate, so I got a master's from Georgetown, so welcome home. He is also someone whose work in this area all of us up here have profited from over the years. I am just going to offer an overview of where I think things are. There are a lot of very specific subjects, notably, I'm sure it will come up, the whole question of hiring and what the rights of religious organizations are to, depending on your point of view, offer preferences or discriminate in favor of members of their congregations. I'm sure we'll get to those questions, but I want to sort of put this conversation in two contexts. One, a little bit historical, and the other in the context of the present moment. I've been working on this issue now for quite a while. I started most recently doing work on this with my friend John DiIulio back in the late 90s at Brookings. And I will still remember a meeting we had to discuss the whole idea of government faith-based partnerships. It was after Congress had passed charitable choice. And it was one of the most amazing collections of people who had ever walked into the Brookings Institution, because it ranged from, and I'll get to him in a second, someone from the gospel mission movement. I love those folks. They are the folks who deal with essentially the folks on the street, drunks on Skid Row, the folks who were totally ignored by everyone else, fall through the cracks in the social service system. We had a lot of great representatives of the African American church, Catholics, Protestants, Jews, all the way over to arch secularists, agnostics. It was a very lively group. And I remember that day learning that this whole question of should government help faith-based groups, should faith-based groups seek the help of government, cuts across more lines than we realize. And I realized this when the gentleman from the gospel missions got up, looked at the audience, said, well, just so you know who we are the people who hit you over the head with the Bible and pour soup down your throat. And then he proceeded to talk about how he feared taking government aid, that at that moment he was not interested in taking government aid because he was worried that taking any government aid would get in the way of his preaching the true gospel. And there were moments in that conversation where our friend from the gospel mission movement and another friend from Americans United for the Separation of Church and State were actually taking the same side on certain questions. And so the lines on these issues are not always as clear as we draw them. I've thought of my work in some ways as trying to make politics a little safer for faith-based partnerships with government. By that I mean two things. Firstly, and this is where the report Melissa Rogers and I did together went, it was trying to figure out how to do these things in ways that did not push too hard at the edges of church-state traditions of either separation or autonomy, church-state autonomy. That these partnerships can be exceptionally controversial if people try to push these limits too hard, and they can be rather unifying if people live within reasonable constitutional grounds. It's safe in another way because it seems to me, and I'm going to close on this, that of all questions where we shouldn't have extraordinary ideological division, but where we often do have extraordinary ideological division, it is in this area. Because who on the liberal side can disagree with the need to do more for the least, the neediest among us, and who on the conservative side does not honor the work of all kinds of civil society nonprofits, including the churches. And yet, we have found ourselves deeply divided on these questions, particularly over the last 8 years. I think that it is a fact that a liberal Democratic president may actually have a better shot at making peace in this area than a conservative Republican president. I believe that's true partly because a liberal Democratic president comes with more implicit trust on that side of the political spectrum that is most skeptical of these partnerships, that a liberal Democratic president might not be seen as someone who would ride over these lines as readily as a conservative Republican president. Even if those perceptions for our Republican friends in the audience are unfair, I think they're very strong. And I think Barack Obama has an exceptional opportunity to do this. He had already staked out during his campaign a rather different approach to religion and politics questions than we'd heard for some time. On the one hand, he noted that Americans were tired of seeing faith used as a tool of attack. He said he was weary of hearing folks deliver more screed than sermon. At the same time, he criticized those who dismiss religion in the public square as inherently irrational or intolerant. He urged respect for believers and unbelievers alike, and he signaled his effort to sort of reach some sort of cultural peace in this area by endorsing government partnerships with faith-based groups, suggesting he would reform President Bush's program, but would not in any way end these partnerships. In talking about trying to make the world safe for these things, it seems to me useful to try to move this to a common sense view. Now, I know philosophers will tell me that there's much controversy around the words common sense. And yet I kind of liked Obama's statement that, you know, when we have this many problems, we need an all hands on deck approach. And that what we're talking about is trying to bring together with government grassroots groups, both faith-based and secular, to solve key problems. Now, the other reason I think there's promise here is because perhaps the end of the Bush administration will remind us that President Bush didn't invent these partnerships. And I think there's a tendency in this debate on both sides to exaggerate exaggerate the sense in which all this started under President Bush. Sometimes his supporters want to do that to say this is a great achievement. Sometimes his critics want to do that because they want to say all these partnerships are kind of corrupt and cross church-state boundaries in every instance. For many people in this room, I don't have to go through the history that these partnerships in some ways go back right to the beginning of the Republic. When I was doing research on my book Sold Out, I learned that Franklin Roosevelt was very active in trying to build partnerships with African-American churches back in the 1930s. It is no accident that Franklin Roosevelt was trying to convert African-Americans into Democrats, which he actually did a pretty good job of in the 1930s. There was a rally at Madison Square Garden of a group of African-Americans and labor folks trying to rally to Roosevelt, and they unfurled a banner of the three liberators. And it was Jesus who liberated us from sin, and Abraham Lincoln who liberated us from bondage, and Franklin D. Roosevelt who liberated us from social injustice. And as Melissa and I note in our report, you carried this forward, the Clinton administration was very active in building these partnerships. Someone well known to this community, Father Joe Hakala, who had headed the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, was the religious outreach person, I've forgotten what his formal title was, at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So I'm hoping we can put some of the controversies of the last 8 years behind us and try to figure out where we can go on this. In our report, Melissa and I suggested a number of things that might be done to reduce the dangers of crossing church-state lines that have created some of these controversies. We also call attention to what both of us think is not discussed enough, which is how often these partnerships don't involve money. It is very disturbing that almost as soon as you talk about the words faith-based, the argument quickly devolves into an argument about money. Now, my friend Jerome Kapulski back there said that's not surprising at all, but it ought to make religious people feel a little guilty that that's what happens time after time. And I am hoping that in the new discussion we're going to begin, we talk about the many non-financial partnerships. A good example of how religious groups often serve as vouching agents for activists in poor neighborhoods trying to bring money in for housing or daycare centers or the like. They don't get any money from government, but they become the means through which government money flows to groups that deserve it and should get it. I think the other thing that Melissa and I suggest in our report, and then I'll close, is we think it is problematic, and here Stanley and Stanley might disagree a little bit, for government money to flow directly to houses of worship. We worry very much of what happens when the IRS or some, not even the IRS, but some government agency that's giving the money has to audit the program. You can't get government money without accountability. Should churches, synagogues, mosques want the government in their books? We suggest that money shouldn't go to the house of worship, but that we should create a far easier system for charities to obtain 501c3 status so that the religious institutions can do the good work without raising these issues and without inviting the government into their books. I'll just close by saying that we have been fighting cultural and religious wars in politics for too long. And on this issue, more than most others, I think we really need an exodus from the deserts of partisanship, from unnecessary division, and especially a moratorium on arguments that give more satisfaction to the people having the argument than to those who hear them, or to those who are affected by them. Lord knows I love argument. I believe in argument. I make my living on argument. But what I don't like are unnecessary arguments where they don't move us forward and where people often seem to be having them simply for the sake of having them. I think we're at a moment where we can look again honestly at the history and the evidence, and that we can do much more than we have done recently to find common ground. I think our new president can encourage us to recognize that people of goodwill may disagree on many questions related to politics, theology, and belief itself, may have some disagreements on where church-state issues should arise and where they don't, and still find ways to work in common on behalf of those in need. We should be trying to strengthen the bonds of community and mutual responsibility, an area which has caused so much division, I hope can become a source of community and cooperation in the coming years. Thank you.
I too would like to thank Michael and the center for putting together a very impressive company here, and all of you as well for being here this afternoon to hear us. There's definitely a renewed interest in this subject of faith-based partnerships. Since Obama, the Democrats have taken it up. It's been going in the city for at least 7 years in an intense way, but the last 4 years, the second Bush administration, it sort of flattened out for the most part. People have sort of been through these rehearsed arguments. But now that the Democrats and Obama have taken it up, here we are talking about it. Yes, talking about it fresh. But whether or not it's fresh in the new administration, and without regard to political party, there are some inescapable tensions in this enterprise. Forgive me, E.J., you were trying to give there's no red states, blue states speech. There's just states, and yes, you're right, there's common ground on serving the poor, but there are some tensions in this enterprise that I think we cannot avoid. On the one hand, we have whatever value added would come from inclusion of faith-based organizations as partners with government in the delivery of social services. And they may reach different people, they may reach people in a different way than other organizations would be able to reach. On the other hand, we have constitutional concerns about government subsidy or financial support for religious indoctrination. That is a First Amendment Establishment Clause-based constitutional concern. And we have other public concerns about government subsidy for enterprises that do not afford equal employment opportunity. Now, that hiring question is complicated, and I'll get to it before I'm done. I also think it's a sidebar. I think for the last 8 years I've been saying that the hiring question is a sidebar. All the fussing in Congress, all the fussing in politics about the faith-based initiative has been on the hiring question. Why? Because it just splits people off into sort of right, left, far opposing camps. You have some folks saying, oh, we have to maintain our religious identity, and other folks saying, no, this taxpayer should not be supporting jobs that are limited by faith, and this is really a cover for discrimination based on sexual orientation or based on race. Very divisive kinds of opposing arguments, and that's where the political energy has been. Okay? I think there are ways of resolving all that will make everyone a little bit unhappy, and I'll get to that, I hope, before I'm done. I think the centerpiece of this is about service content, what it is that government may pay consistent with the Constitution, what may government pay or support religious organizations in doing. And that hasn't been the center of political attention, partly because it's a matter of constitutional law, but partly because people don't really understand it, and they don't really want to try too hard to understand it for whatever their reasons. So I'm going to say a little bit about that, the service content problem, before I get to the hiring problem. This is a constitutional matter. The rules, at least up to a significant level, are not up to the president or Congress. They have to find ways of complying with constitutional law. And in some ways, the governing rule on this subject, and it's changed over time in ways that have increasingly permitted religious organizations to be partner, even intensely religious organizations, to partner with government in the provision of social services. What has not changed over time is the core of the rule about government direct subsidy for religious experience. government may not subsidize religious experience or religious indoctrination. They can't subsidize it by way of paying for labor, that is counselors, social service counselors. They can't subsidize it in paying for materials, Bibles and materials that have religious content. And a government can't subsidize it by paying for space, that is paying for the rent or the renovation of rooms in which religious instruction or religious experience takes place. To put it in a positive instead of a negative way, programs directly funded by the government, I'm bracketing out voucher programs and other kinds of sort of special cases that we could talk about, programs directly funded by the government must be entirely secular in their content. And over the last 8 years, there have been a number of lawsuits against grants made to faith-based organizations that have not respected that rule. And when organizations don't respect that rule and they have religious content in their service, the government loses those lawsuits. And quite repeatedly, the government in the lower courts, state government, sometimes federal government, has lost those lawsuits. Now, the Bush administration implemented this command, the no subsidy for religious experience command, ambiguously. They announced a rule across the government that said that government funds may not be used for inherently religious activities, such as worship, religious instruction, or proselytizing. Now, that rule was right as far as it went, but it didn't go all the way to the full meaning of the constitutional norm, and it left room for uncertainty or doubt. Which activities are inherently religious? Is social service that includes religious themes and religious preaching as part of the service covered? Well, the answer is yes. Those kinds of services are covered by that rule. The government may not subsidize religiously themed social services, but the Bush administration was not nearly as clear and as direct on communicating this as I think it should have been, or as it might have been. And this is a continuing problem of communication. Now, will the Obama folks fix it? I don't know. During the campaign, Obama at one point made a nice, clear speech on this. We said, government-funded programs have to be secular programs only. Religious organizations can do them, but those programs have to be secular. But then lately he's fallen back on the use of the word proselytizing. Government may not pay for proselytizing. Well, that's right. It may not, but it's much too narrow. Much too narrow. Proselytizing, we understand, means conversion from one faith to another. The limitations on sub-government support here are not limited to proselytizing. They're much broader than that. And I fear that this is not going to be any easier for Josh Dubois than it was for his predecessors in that office, who tend to be churchmen or people who are involved in some significant way in religious life. And their job, the people who run the faith-based office, their job is to go out and communicate with religious organizations, and they speak a vocabulary of faith. And Obama now wants to have policies about responsible fatherhood and relief of poverty. And you can talk about those things in secular terms, but you can talk about them in religious terms. And I'm watching closely to see whether the Obama administration does a better job than the Bush administration does in communicating with clarity on the content limitations with respect to directly funded programs. Now, with respect to the hiring question, the hiring question is not as simple as the contending sides would like to make it. On the one hand, faith-based organizations have a right to do faith-based hiring if they are privately financed. That is, we don't think it's invidious discrimination for faith groups to hire only their own when they are being privately financed. On the other hand, we ordinarily insist on strict non-discrimination rules in employment and in beneficiaries for service when the government is the financer. And the government has a well-recognized power to impose conditions of service on grantees. If the government puts up money for domestic violence programs, it can say, you have to teach female empowerment. You may not teach submissiveness of females to the man of the house in the government finance program. Religious organizations have a right to preach male dominance and female submissiveness if they choose. That's a religious doctrine. But the government can say, that is not an approach we're going to pay for. So the government has power to condition its grants on various conditions of service. Sometimes they go to content. Sometimes they go to structure of operation, and the employment restrictions are about structure of operation. So what should the government's policy be about permitting faith-based groups, which have a private right to do faith-based hiring, to continue it or not with respect to their government-funded programs. Well, we could look at this as a matter of high principle. Yes, right or wrong. Religious identity on the one hand, equal employment opportunity on the other hand, and I think we'll get nowhere if we set it up that way, because we'll just have the clashing arguments that E.J. was talking about. We could alternatively, and this is my view, we could think about this as a matter of efficient delivery, successful delivery of services to people who need the services. One of the reasons this fight's a sidebar is that it's all focused on who gets the jobs and who keeps the jobs and which organizations can hire which way, instead of looking at who is being served at the far end of the tunnel of these programs. So it seems to me, and E.J. and Melissa call for this in their paper, I think we need a lot more information about how many faith-based programs out there want grants or have grants and want to insist on faith-based hiring. What would happen if we changed those rules? Would those organizations say, sorry, never mind, if we can't do faith-based hiring, we're not playing anymore? How many of those are there? Who do they serve? Would some of those organizations just conform and set up separate staffs for these programs, or would they not? Would we reach more people if we permitted faith-based hiring, more beneficiaries? Would we reach more people? Would we reach them more effectively? Or might we just change the mix of providers if we don't allow faith-based hiring by grantees, in which case the case for allowing this kind of employment policy gets considerably weaker. Now, even when the Obama administration, if I should say, gets this additional information, which they may not get, and I see my time is up, so I'm going to stop by saying, yeah, I'm going to stop. No, because if you let me keep going, I got 4 more minutes about the law. So I'm going to give you the 30-second version about the law, okay? Even when this information is in hand, Obama is going to have a terribly difficult time sorting out the policy options before him. When he announced 2 months ago that he was reviewing this question about hiring to White House counsel, the Department of Justice, and his faith-based office for review, people thought he was copying out, people thought he was hiding, people thought it was a chicken move. I did not. The law in this area is very complicated. There are many, it's not constitutional law, it's statutory law, it's separation of powers law, it's how much can the president do, it's how much can the Congress do. Even with full information, there are a lot of layers that have to be unpacked. In the end, if Obama wants to do everything he can to eliminate faith-based hiring, he won't be able to eliminate it all. And whatever he does, I think some people are going to be considerably unhappy at the resolution of this particular issue in the White House.
Well, we have common ground or we don't.
We can agree on that.
We can agree on that. You know, I actually think there's more division about these things in Washington than out in the real world. In other words, things go on, and they've gone on in a way that's not precisely captured in the debate here. But of course, one of the challenges is to figure out what is going on, what's appropriate about it, what needs to be changed. So I'm not against debates, I just think things look more precipitous up here than they do out in real life. Well, I'm honored to be part of this panel, and thanks for inviting me to offer some comments. I want to make 2 preliminary comments and then say some things about the larger architecture of the faith-based initiative, and then some comments and questions on the Obama initiative. So, 2 preliminary points. First of all, the faith-based initiative, I think, is extremely important. Important area of government policy and reform, so I want to start by saluting President Obama for making a strong commitment to something that he knew would be subject to a lot of criticism. So he did it. I think it's very important that he did it following a Republican president who had a whole different perspective on many of these things. Second preliminary comment, I'd like to set to the side the controversial topic of religious hiring. As many have said, if this issue is made the focus of attention, then all movement in this policy area just gets bogged down. I suggest that President Obama ought to leave this controversy alone. Indeed, he's letting existing policy continue for now, and I think that's the right decision. But I do have to say something on the topic. If effective help means an all-hands approach, as the President has said, then I think there needs to be an accommodation to the freedom faith-based groups have under the law to take account of religion in making employment decisions. Obviously, this is a complicated issue. It's clear that religious organizations aren't forced to hire according to faith, The freedom that's protected in the Civil Rights Act simply leaves it to them and not government to decide how important religion is as one of the criteria for jobs in what is, after all, a religious organization. In many cases, these organizations are communities of service and faith, communities that extend to donors and volunteers. Take away that faith connection, and I think the motivation and passion is going to dissipate. This freedom is a defining issue for many faith-based organizations that I know. They want their services and not their employment practices to be the deciding issue when they apply to the government for funds to provide services. But if a ban on religious hiring is the price of the funds, many of them will no longer be able to be the federal government's partners. Well, what about the central goal of the faith-based initiative? I think that goal is effective service. The central focus in a lot of the discussion and policy change has been how to improve the government's partnership with civil society in responding to social needs. That's the way to reach the goal of more effective service. This partnership idea, and I'm glad that President Obama has stressed it, means that in responding to need, the government should acknowledge that civil society plays a vital role. That isn't to say that government is unimportant, it's just that civil society is also important. And that poses the question, what is the appropriate relationship then between the government and these other entities that are also busy and have been for decades and centuries in the very same areas of public concern? Catholic programs that serve families in public housing, Jewish job training, emergency feeding programs, evangelical programs that help ex-prisoners find a way back into society, and thousands of other services and organizations of diverse faiths. For an all-hands approach, there's got to be an extensive collaboration in these areas where both sides are working in the same area. So, in considering how the Obama faith-based community and neighborhood partnership might unfold, I suggest we should think not in the first place about that advisory council or the revised White House office, or the dozen centers out in federal agencies, not even the extra money for social services, and the plan for $500 million a year for a new summer learning program. Instead, we should consider the multiple ways that government relates to civil society. Let me mention just two ends of the spectrum. You already heard them. Two places to watch how the Obama administration will work to improve the government's partnership with civil society. One end is this diverse set of non-financial relationships. How can the government's action best be coordinated with private groups? There are all kinds of areas here, and I just use as one example, the Bush administration, I think, started important work to draw churches and smaller secular groups into coordination with government in disaster preparedness and disaster response. They're there, they're critical to the preparedness and response. How does that connect with the government's own networks? Well, where else can the government better coordinate its work with private organizations? I hope that's going to be a major topic. Even more important than this programmatic relationship, I think, is a general area of regulation. Do the government's rules protect the integrity and distinctive characteristics of faith-based organizations or subject them to the same rules that are appropriate for secular organizations? For example, do accreditation standards respect the religious mission of religious higher education? Do the rules that govern professional training and licensing in hospitals respect institutions and professionals with a conscientious objection to certain procedures? I think even more than what happens in the official faith-based initiative on these non-financial relationships, what this administration and what the states do in this area of regulation, licensing, accreditation, public accommodation law, and so on, will contribute to the flourishing or enfeeblement of civil society over time. At the other end is a financial partnership. Government money awarded to private, secular, and religious organizations to provide services. This is a critical area of concern because of all the money, because of the Constitution, because we ought to care that people getting services get the best services possible, and because the government rightly attaches many conditions to the money awards. Conditions or strings are necessary and right, but which are the right conditions and strings? Isn't that the discussion? The character of the rules is important not only to faith-based groups. An important 1993 book by Stephen Smith and Michael Lipsky looked at state contracting with private organizations to provide social services. In working with the private groups, the state government hoped to capture the creativity of the private groups, their trust relationships with people needing help, their specialized knowledge and expertise. Yet, Smith and Lipsky called their book Nonprofits for Hire. Not exactly a title suggesting a partnership. Why that title? Well, the strings that came to the government money turned the civil society groups into mini government agencies. They did exactly what the government wanted, but pretty much exactly how the government itself would have done it. Instead of capturing the creativity and energy of the groups, the government's overregulation extinguished the special civil society qualities it had hoped to gain. Well, the concern of that book, I think, has been a core concern of the faith-based initiative, how to optimize these rules for the relationship between government and civil society groups, particularly when government money is involved. How do we make it a true partnership that preserves the special strengths and connections of those private groups, both secular and religious? As you'll recognize, that's a theme of Catholic social teaching called subsidiarity, or in my neo-Calvinist tradition, sphere sovereignty. Well, President Obama has stressed improving the federal partnership in neighborhood organizations. Seems to me a really important goal. But it does pose a policy challenge. Neighborhood groups are not highly structured or devoted to reports and documentation. How will he engage them more extensively without making them lose their grassroots character? And how will the president build partnerships with churches and other houses of worship? I have my qualms about this, but they're often the primary functioning social organization in struggling neighborhoods. Some have claimed that the Bush faith-based rules and charitable choice unconstitutionally allowed government money to go to churches. What will President Obama do about this if he wants to reach deep into neighborhoods? And churches and church-based organizations are what really functions and what draws people. And what about that other criticism, that restrictions on faith groups were relaxed too much? Chip talked about this. And so people in need were subjected to unwanted and wrong religious activities. Well, there have been court cases, I think not as many violations as people thought there might be, but religious freedom is vital, and it is wrong for a person needing help to be subjected to unwanted religious pressure, and there are constitutional concerns, of course, as well. So there's work to be done on the rules and on training and oversight. But I think what is needed is not a big crackdown on faith groups. There needs to be more clarity about the rules, for sure. But I think what's needed is administrative creativity and reform. Federal, state, and local governments should work to incorporate more choice into social service programs, expanding on existing successful choice models like government-funded child care and the Access to Recovery drug treatment program. In these programs, a person needing the services can choose from a range of providers, both secular programs and programs that utilize religious activities. This kind of innovation best protects both people who object to religion as part of the service and the many others who believe that religion can be vital in overcoming serious life challenges. So I'll conclude with just a couple of comments about what might be happening. The president announced this faith-based initiative about 2 months ago, but not a whole lot's been revealed since then. Of course, there have been a lot of things going on beyond the faith-based initiative, housing crisis, AIG, and all the rest of it. And of course, because there has been this ongoing policy area, as Chip mentioned, there are a lot of things to evaluate and look at, and a lot of complicated legal and constitutional issues. And I know a lot is going on behind the scenes, but I wonder if there also isn't the issue of these real deep conflicts that have to be dealt with and can't just be glided over. You know, strong critics of the Bush administration were surprised and disappointed that President Obama didn't simply shut down the Bush faith-based initiative. They claimed that the Bush rules were unconstitutional, illegal, wrong, and partisan. And if they were right, the president should have stopped the initiative in its tracks. If hiring on a religious basis by a faith-based organization that takes government money without doubt violates the Constitution, as some people say, then the president has to make it stop. That's not what he's done. Whatever needs to be improved or adjusted, apparently the current laws are not constitutional violations, as some have argued. But then what are the right standards? If the current ones are not so far off that the only solution is to throw them out and go back to something that existed a long time ago. And what to do if you become convinced that banning religious staffing in any program that gets federal funds will cause chaos, because many of the government's partners are faith-based organizations that have always, legally, taken religion into account in hiring people. And they're certain to withdraw if the rule is changed to forbid rather than respect their religious hiring freedom. So I don't know how the Obama faith-based neighborhood partnership is going to deal with these things, but I'm hopeful that the president and Josh Rosenblatt understand that in a true partnership, the government will respect the unique qualities and the diverse characteristics of its civil society allies, including the faith-based ones. Thank you.
Just one addendum to my introduction of Melissa. I neglected to mention that earlier this year she was appointed to the President's Council for the faith-based neighborhood partnerships.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks to you for organizing this event, and thanks to all of you for being here. I'm very honored to be on this panel with people that I respect so much, and also to see so many of you out in the crowd that I've had the pleasure of working with over the years, and I'm looking forward to our conversation in a minute. Since Michael mentioned the council, let me just say a few words about the council to get started. It will be eventually made up of 25 members who serve one-year terms. 15 members have been named, and 10 are to be named, and I think will be named soon. The council, one of the council's function is going to be making recommendations to the administration about how government partnerships with religious and other community groups should be structured and how they should operate. There are also some other issues, I think Chip mentioned a few of them earlier, that the council is focused on, and I'd be happy to take those up later if you wish. We've already had a number of phone calls, those of us who've been named to the council, to discuss a variety of issues, and we're getting ready to divide up into task forces that will address all the different issues that the President has asked us to look at. The task forces will be made up of both council members and those outside the council, and will deliberate on those issues and then bring information back to the council as a whole, and then the council as a whole will make recommendations to the administration. There's going to be public in-person meetings of the council as well as phone calls, and in addition to these task force meetings, I believe there will be 4 over the next year, and they will be public, and so certainly that will be something, if you're interested in this area, you could participate in. I should say right away that the council will not make decisions about which groups get government funds, so please don't send me your grant requests. I actually had a funny thing happen before I even got off of the White House grounds. When we were named to this council, I had a grant request already on my BlackBerry. So, and that has just exponentially grown since. So I want to make very clear that I will not, and the council will not be making decisions about who gets government money. The White House also will not be...
Half the room is left at that point.
The White House office actually itself will not be making those decisions either, as Stanley can attest, having worked in the Bush White House. That was also not, well, Stanley had a similar experience when he worked for the Bush administration, but they will not be making decisions. These decisions will be made in the agencies. And also I should just underscore the fact that the council will make recommendations. We advise the president and the administration decide. So, and so let me just note that I'm not speaking for the council or the administration, and let me also note that the things that I will say, some of my fellow council members will disagree with some of the positions that I'm going to take. So I think that would be obvious, but I want to just mention that. Well, as E.J. mentioned, our report called on the Obama administration to retain but also reform government partnerships with community groups, including religious social service providers. And a couple of words of background that I can say quickly because they've already been mentioned by others. One is that our report emphasizes that these partnerships with religious and other organizations long predate the Bush administration. Stanley said it as well. So people are certainly within their rights to take the position that the government should never allow religious organizations to compete for social service funding, but that would be a break not only with the Bush administration, but also with Democratic and Republican administrations going back for many years. Second, our report focuses on the postures and policies that the government should take. And we say that the government should welcome properly structured, constitutionally sound partnerships with religious groups. Religious groups, on the other hand, have a different calculus to make, and one of them is, can they live with the funds that follow, the rules that follow government funds? That's a serious question, one that each religious group must look at in a very sober way before entering into any financial partnerships with government. And E.J. already mentioned our concern about houses of worship in particular, that we believe that they should not receive direct government aid for a variety of reasons. Third, this also has been touched on, that partnerships, when I talk about them, and I'm pleased to say that the administration has been talking about them this way, partnerships encompasses both financial and non-financial partnerships. Non-financial partnerships have tended to be overlooked, shunted to one side, but in truth they are as valuable to government as financial partnerships, and they pose far fewer constitutional problems. So I hope that we will continue to put more focus on those very useful partnerships. Well, the administration is clearly retaining the partnerships. What about the reform agenda? Let me just make a couple of comments about that. There are some reforms that the administration has already made. We're in the early days of the presidency, obviously, just a few months underway, but some reforms have already been made. We're seeing through the president's budget that to a significant degree, he is beginning to reverse a trend towards cuts in programs that actually help low-income families, so that's been an important marker that the president has laid down. He's also, as I've already talked about, established a diverse White House council. The council that is already, or the members that have already been named, I think it's fair to say that the administration has included those with some good faith differences with the administration on its positions on some issues, and it's definitely included people with different theological and political points of view. Now, we can argue about whether they get the balance exactly right, but I think it's a real step forward for the administration to bring in people who disagree with it in good faith on some matters, but to say we want you at the table, we want to make these decisions in as common ground a way as possible. As Chip notes, that's not always possible, but as much as possible we want to make those efforts. The administration also is making reforms, I think, by bringing these efforts more integrating them more into the domestic policy agenda as a whole, as opposed to keeping them divorced from the overall effort to overcome poverty and to achieve other administration agenda items. Reforms that have yet to be made, and Chip touched on this, are ones that fix constitutional deficiencies in the Bush rules, including the confusing rule that Chip mentioned about use of direct aid. I believe that this rule needs to be fixed, partially because, well, one important reason is because it violates the Constitution if direct aid is used to subsidize religious activities, but also because it's the inherently religious prohibition, the prohibition on using direct aid for inherently religious activities, has proven to be very confusing for providers, and I think creates an undue risk of litigation for them. And so as much as imposing constitutional principles, we also need to look out for the providers and ensure that they understand the rules. And there are other rules connected to this that deal with separation of religious activities from government-funded activities. It is appropriate and necessary, in my view, that there be that separation between government-funded activities, those funded by direct aid, and privately funded religious activities. There have to be a very clear separation between those things so that beneficiaries understand that there is no requirement on them whatsoever to participate in religious activities in order to reap the benefits of the government program. And that's obviously a complicated area that needs attention. Well, we said, and there are many other rules that I could go into about beneficiary protections and monitoring of church-state guidelines that also need attention. But I'm not going to have time to go into them all right now. But let me just say that in our December report that EJ and I wrote, we said that some of these changes should be made right away with common ground efforts and information gathering efforts to follow. Now, the administration has made some efforts to set up common ground discussions, but we have not gotten to making these rule changes. And I think that we really need to keep our eye on that ball, because the situation at present is that a lot of money will be flowing out to social service programs, and yet these deficiencies that exist in the Bush rules have not been corrected. So I think there really needs to be attention paid to making those corrections as soon as possible, so that we get the constitutional issues right and make sure that providers are clear about what they can and can't do and beneficiaries are protected. And just on the information gathering aspect, I think that is also good. Being deliberate and careful is obviously a good thing, especially in a complex area. But also, as the book of Ecclesiastes says, to everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under heaven. We also have to be sure that there is a timetable for decision making about controversial issues, difficult issues, complex issues. We need to have a transparent process, a defined process, and a process that has a defined time for decision making on these complex issues. In other words, I do not think it's good to let, for example, on the employment issue, for that to linger indefinitely. I know Stanley and I differ on the employment issue, but I would not want to see the Bush rules continue in the way that they are currently constructed. I think we need to have a timetable and a defined process and a transparent process for coming to a decision on those issues. Let me just close by saying, and this will hopefully start to get us into some of the debates and that we focus on in this area. And one was that there's a debate about whether government direct funds should be able to use to subsidize religious activities. Well, I think the Constitution says no. I agree with Chip on that. But I also want to add that I think it would be very bad for religion if the government funded religious activities. What the government funds, the government regulates. As a person of faith, the very last thing I want is for the government to fund and regulate my religious activities, worship, evangelism, Bible study. I don't want the government to fund or to regulate. And those things go together. They always do. They always will. And that is one reason why I really don't want the government to fund religious activities. If we fund faith activities, we also open the door to some pretty explosive debates about whose religion actually produces the better results. Is it the gospel of the Christian church that actually really helps people get off drugs? Or is it some other faith that actually has a better record on getting people off drugs? And I think we also begin to walk into a dangerous area where we begin to use religion as an engine of social policy, government social policy. James Madison said that we should not do that a long, long time ago. And I happen to agree with him. So I think that it would not only be bad for government, but also bad for religion, for the government to fund religious activities. So I think that we can do a lot of good here on the common ground issues. I think we've made a good start on including a diverse group to discuss these issues. And I look forward to the effort to both serve people in need and respect religious freedom in the process of doing so. Thank you.
Well, thank you for each of the panelists. I think in the interest of time, what I'd like to do is ask each of you to take a minute or two to offer any clarifications, responses, questions, gripes to other panelists about what they said, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. And we'll probably go until 1:40, so if you have to leave at 1:30, feel free.
Yeah, I just want to say very quickly, I'm going to prove that wonderful adage that a liberal is someone who can't even take his own side in a debate by agreeing heartily with Chip that there are a whole bunch of really hard questions that are divisive in this area, and that they have to be, they will be debated and resolved. But I've thought that there are two ways of posing certain issues. One is what side of the fight you're on, and the other is how much do you want to have a fight in the first place. And it does seem to me that there are certain issues that do have to be resolved. Hiring is clearly one of them. And yet there are a whole bunch of areas where I think that even though there will be controversy surrounding each of them, there is a better shot of reaching some kind of consensus. And I would also point to history to say that a whole lot of partnerships of this sort, you know, the standard list, Catholic Charities, Lutheran Services, the Jewish Federations, the African American churches, have gone on for a very, very long time with not as much controversy as we've seen in the last 8 years. You know, when Melissa and I did our report, there were a bunch of things we suggested which we know could be sources of big fights depending on how you did them. but are basically things that most people engaged in this agree with. One is protecting the rights of religious beneficiaries under these programs, as all of us, I think, share a view of that. We might disagree about precisely how you do that, but you can't use a government program to force religion on someone. Figure out how you monitor these programs, obviously for corruption purposes, but also for compliance on church-state questions. And that's a matter of degree. If you have pervasive monitoring, when Melissa and I were talking about this, I said we don't want to write this in a way that people will suspect we want to create an anti-religious KGB here. And so yes, you don't want to go all the way down one road, but a certain amount of monitoring is necessary, otherwise people can violate the law. Chip had mentioned some of the Bush rules, clarified the restrictions on direct aid to religious activities, so it's absolutely clear. We ought to be able to find agreement on that. How do you have better systems of evaluation and accountability? Since I recently defended President Obama on that restriction he wants to place on the deduction, on the charitable deduction, I want to square that with what we say in the report, where we call for expanded opportunities for charitable giving. It seems to me that you can combine that restriction with incentives. You can't itemize charitable giving on the short form, for example. So a whole lot of Americans, including some of the most generous, poor people give away more money as a percentage of income than wealthier people do. You could do that. And I actually think that would be a nice balance with what the president is proposing. This is, in some sense, beyond today's discussion, but central to it. I think we need a much larger debate about contracting out government services, because in some ways this whole faith-based issue is a subset of the larger trend toward contracting out government services. There are some areas where that's a good idea, but I think we've had too much of an ideological debate about that. I think there are some services government may want to take back in to its own direct responsibility again. And I had the mischievous thought as we were talking that actually the president's leading faith-based initiative is the government can actually rescue the banking and financial system, and we all pray that he succeeds.
I'm going to be, just two basic points. I'm going to be brief. First, on the point about the rules about content and clarity of those rules, one of the things we haven't talked about is the problem of federalism and decentralization. So there are many layers here that these rules have to go through, not only from the bureaucracy in Washington to this room and lawyers who are going to talk about them, or even to federal grantees, but they have to be communicated to state agencies and local agencies, and then to their grantees. There's always translation problems, right, when you run these things down the line. And actually, Bob Tuttle and I have done a number of workshops for sort of state and local administrators on the faith-based initiative and the constitutional rules, and they're just they're desperate for information, and they haven't gotten much guidance. And I know at the end of the Bush administration, they were working on federalism in the sense of getting states involved in this, but I think there also has to be some work on communicating clearly to state and local governments what their responsibilities are. Now, the second point is about the hiring question. And I understand exactly why Stanley thinks that President Obama should just let the status quo sit. It's because it's very friendly to his position. And it's friendly to his position because hiring freedom was the default rule. That is, private organizations have this right to hire on the basis of faith. So the government has to do something to take that away. And if the government doesn't do anything to take it away, it tends to be there. And on top of that, the Bush administration just propelled that rule, the hiring freedom rule, quite aggressively. So Obama has to take rather aggressive moves to change it. And even if he wants to take them, and I was suggesting this at the end of my remarks, when he said in his speech at that prayer breakfast on February 5th, oh, this may be done case by case, I think people were very confused about that. Did he mean this grant and this grant, this provider and this provider? I think the answer is no. I think he meant funding stream by funding stream. If you study the law on this subject, you see that certain federal funding streams are saddled with restrictions here or affirmations. Some of the funding streams say you must recognize the right to do faith-based hiring, and some of the funding streams have laws that say no employment discrimination by anybody with respect to religion, and third set of funding streams say nothing on the subject. So this is part of why you do need to get the lawyers in to sort out what the different rules are. And I think at the end of the day, we're going to get different policies, funding stream by funding stream. And that's why I suggested not everyone would be happy with the outcome.
Yeah, we shouldn't all make new speeches, although I'm tempted. Yeah, so we already have a funding stream by funding stream determination on hiring. So now some people want to reopen that, so that can be done. I just think if we're going to reopen it, we have to take it the other direction. But that's obviously a huge discussion on its own. I want to just say a word about the religious content. I think this is really critical. It's also extremely difficult. You know, it's clear that the federal funds aren't to be used for worship and proselytizing and things like that. But, you know, in many cases, the way that faith comes into a service, including in ostensibly secular job training programs, I've been told by Steve Monsma, is in a way that's part of the service that's being provided. It's an affirmation of the person's dignity. It's help to them to struggle through difficult times. It's a source of guidance for what choices you're going to make about your life and all those kinds of things. That's not preaching. That's not worship service. That's entirely relevant to the service as an appropriate way to do this. Is an important way to deal with this problem, because I don't think you can draw the sharp line that constitutional lawyers would like to draw between religion being in and out if you look at the actual practice out in the world.
Yeah, I'll resist temptation as well and try to keep my remarks really brief. Indirect funding that Stanley talks about, they're at least from the school voucher context, we know that there are different constitutional rules that would seem to apply if there is truly a choice among providers in the social service context that constitutionally would allow religious activities potentially to be woven into government-funded activities. But indirect funding still comes with government regulation. You don't get vouchers free of government regulation. So I think there's still problems with this construct from a lot of different angles. And too often, I think people sort of understand this whole issue as if vouchers come free of government regulation. They do not. So that's just one thing to tee up for discussion. Stanley's right that funding streams, you know, there are different funding streams today, and Chip said this, some that are governed by non-discrimination rules, some that are governed by allowing religious groups to discriminate with respect on basis of religion with respect to government-funded jobs. Bush, and during the Bush presidency, a lot of rule changes were made that allowed religious discrimination in government-funded jobs where it previously had not been clear, or and we can get to the specific examples in a minute. But another controversial thing that the Bush administration did is say that the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, an act which had a lot of bipartisan support and broad support in the religious and civil liberties community, at least in some cases, required the government to give exemptions from existing non-discrimination rules and statutes that govern some certain social service programs. So there are some programs that have non-discrimination rules in employment. The religious groups get the money. What one of them did was ask the government to give them an exemption under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, saying that it was a substantial burden on their religious freedom not to be able to hire and fire on the basis of religion for government-funded jobs, and that the government had no compelling interest for enforcing that rule against them. The Justice Department in the Bush years said, okay, that's right, we approve of your analysis and you get an exemption. And before the Bush administration left, it sent out notices saying anybody else who would like a similar exemption is encouraged to apply. In my view, that is a very serious misreading of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, needs to be addressed as quickly as possible, and providers need to be told that is an appropriate construction of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. So that would just be one example of some changes that I'd hope to see under the Obama administration.
Well, we have some time for questions, especially if I'm very much in appreciation that everyone really did make an effort to stick with the timetable. So if everyone asking questions could also try to be pithy. I'm going to ask the first one. February 5th, the White House, after the prayer breakfast, put out a press release, listed 4 direct goals for the office. The 4th one we haven't talked about, and I'm perplexed as to what it is. We are engaged as a university, as a Catholic Jesuit university, in promoting interfaith dialogue. I'm not so clear how that works even at a state university with a program. I certainly am not clear what that looks like for a government agency to direct it. And I'll just read what the press release said. Finally, number 4, beyond American shores, this office will work with the National Security Council to foster interfaith dialogue with leaders and scholars around the world. Do you have any idea what that means?
Well, I could say I'm not on that task force, and I'm not. But I think the effort is, and it's still being defined, but is to work with the National Security Council and others at the State Department to involve religious organizations increasingly in areas where there are deep conflicts and where bringing religious groups together for dialogue might play a useful role in diffusing those conflicts. So I actually, if there might be some in the audience who want to speak to this issue more specifically, but I do think that there's an effort to work with existing structures in the State Department to buttress those efforts.
Great. Questions? Yes.
Thank you very much. Just a point of clarification from the panelists. You all talked about the distinction between funding programs and then funding religious experience. But in most cases, most of the service delivery for religious organization is actually a religious experience. It's living out their faith. You know, they don't do it just because they want to do it, they do it because they believe that God requires them to do that. So in essence, by funding programs, even if they don't teach their religion in that, for them, that's a religious experience. So how do you make the distinction between funding a religious experience and funding programs while you cannot distinguish them? And the second part of it is the conversation that we didn't have today, which is what influences the policymakers? Because most of the time we want to think that religion doesn't play a role, but it does because we are all human beings. Thanks.
Thank you.
Well, let me just say something about the first question about, what's religious experience? I mean, what's the content of what's forbidden in terms of religious experience? And my simple answer, and I know it's too simple, is that, religious providers, faith-based providers, we expect them to have religious motivation. They care about delivering service for their own religious reasons as well as other reasons of social justice. And there's no one from the government should be policing the motivation of providers to deliver the service. What is being restricted under constitutional rules is the actual content of the service. It's what you say to the people you're trying to help. And it seems to me, for some providers will have trouble with that. They think and speak and act in the language of faith, and that's their vocabulary. And if they can't break that apart, then they shouldn't be taking the money. They're looking for trouble. But if you can separate your religious reasons for doing something for what you say and do, then I think you can make this work.
Just very quickly, I had a wonderful chat at the end of last year with a person who runs Catholic Relief Services in Afghanistan. And they are under their own very strict restrictions not to proselytize as part of their work, because in some towns, villages, somebody who did that could get killed, in very heavily Muslim towns where this is not taken easily. So there, to the extent that they proselytize, it's only by example and not by content. Now that's a very extreme case, but I think it underscores what Chip said, which is you should not police motives. But that doesn't mean, because many, some good people who work for government social service agencies also do it for religious reasons. They happen to work for a government social service agency.
Yes.
I'm glad the issue of service content has come up, because I think this is an ambiguous area that usually doesn't receive much attention. And Chip, you initially raised this, but I would suggest you sort of tossed up a softball question for yourself when you use the example of a domestic violence program that might teach women they ought to submit to males, and that you should just take it. Because I think that's an easy one, because I don't care if it's a religious program or a secular program. Any such program ought not to receive government funding, certainly not my tax dollars. But I've sat in on many sessions at such programs and homeless programs, etc. And where you get the difficult issue is, for example, where someone will tell women who have suffered, perhaps sexual abuse as young girls, and then abuse from live-in boyfriends or husband, etc. later, that God loves them, that God has a purpose for their life, and that that if they would only work and would just, I think, generally encouraging them, trying to build up their self-esteem. And it's not the center of the message, but yet the name of God is invoked as someone who loves them and cares for them, and because He cares for them, that they too that they should consider themselves important. Now, is that sectarian instruction? It's not worship, it's not proselytizing, but yet it is using religion to deal with a very real problem that a person has. And I've seen this in government-funded programs. Actually, I heard it a couple times in government-run programs. Out there in the real world, these church-state distinctions often get very messy. So I was just wondering if you could comment on how you draw those lines. There's not a bright line between religion and no religion.
Yes, thank you for the question. Let me say two things, Stephen. My example about the domestic violence program was not an example of impermissible religious content. It was an example of the government being free not to fund things with which it disagrees. And you're right, you could teach female submissiveness for secular reasons or religious reasons. It wouldn't matter. The government doesn't have to fund it and is not going to fund it. So let me take the question. So it wasn't a softball in the way you suggested, okay? Because I was using it for a different reason. But let me take your example about sort of, sneaking, or that's not the right word, in bringing God into the conversation in these other kinds of programs where it's not Bible reading, it's not intense religious instruction, but God is playing a part. I think on a straightforward, clean reading of the relevant constitutional rules, it is impermissible to do that with the government's money. Okay? Let me just start there. Okay? The second thing I'm going to say, there is a lot of don't ask, don't tell in the administration of government social service programs. And I don't like to applaud that, but I don't always condemn it either. I think if I were an administrator, I'd say, listen, maybe we should understand who's delivering the service, and perhaps this is a matter of degree. And if there's a light touch, among other things, we want to tell you God loves you as others love you. I don't think administrators are going to crack down. I don't think Americans United for Separation of Church and State is going to show up and bring a lawsuit in that case. So don't ask, don't tell. To a slight degree, it's probably going to work out okay. But the danger is, as soon as you say that, and our grant program providers learn that, then there is a question of where that line gets drawn. And maybe the religious content gets a little heavier, it gets a little heavier, and at some point you are inviting the lawsuit, and you are clearly crossing the constitutional line.
But can I just add one quick thing to that? I think Chip's right. I think that while this wouldn't solve everything that you're talking about, Steve, and I really appreciate, because Stephen has done so much on-the-ground research about how this actually transpires, that I appreciate his word here. But clarifying for providers the rules about the separation between religious activities and government-funded activities, I think could also be useful here to say, that conversation can happen, but it can't happen in the context of the government-funded program. So there's a place for you to be invited to a Bible study, a religious counseling session, and without any pressure, of course, because they can't bring pressure to bear, but to invite a person to have that conversation, but not in that context. And so that's another way to hopefully help in the division of the activities.
Stanley, and then we have a couple of other questions.
This is a great conversation. This is the difficulty, I think. And I would object myself to somebody being forced to go to a program and be indoctrinated, whether it's my tax dollar or not, for that matter. So I think that's just out of bounds. But this is very difficult to know how to draw the lines. And I want to say that besides the difficult thing that was just raised, and I appreciate Melissa's effort to help us through this, I was told by mentors, in which the program is supported by government, even though they're volunteers themselves, the rule is no religion in the mentoring relationship. And the mentors say, well, here's somebody I'm dealing with, they're a person of faith, I'm a person of faith. Their big problem this week has to do with some faith matter, that's what they want to talk about. And you're telling me to shut up for 45 minutes, when our hour's up, then we'll talk about faith. And it just seems like an unnatural thing, given it's a consensual relationship, etc. So that leads me to this observation. You know, many of the practice standards in our helping professions, like counseling and social work, hospice care, doctors, nurses, require these professionals now to take account of spirituality as part of the dimension of the relationship. You know, here's a person who's holistic. They may well be a religious person. That affects how they deal with their problem, how they interpret it, how they solve it. And so it's bad practice just to ignore that in these helping relationships. Many of these professionals are paid by government dollars. I don't find it problematic because they're required to ask for consent. They're required to not use their position of authority to force themselves on the person. But religion's part of that relationship. Certainly religious expression is. Is that a problem? I don't think it fits neatly into the lines we've been trying to draw.
The gentleman in the second table.
Bob Ritter, Albiani Humanist Legal Center. I'd like to ask Chip, Stanley, and Melissa the question, to be very specific, regarding whether or not these faith-based groups can have prayers at the beginning and ending of sessions. I mean, I just don't see a fudge area in this area. I appreciate your comments on that.
Well, the rules are very clear. It can't be part of the program. It's got to be separate. It's got to be clear that it's separate. I think one thing that was done right was the Bush administration saying it's fine if they're on the side, they're voluntary, people want to come to them. You don't have to suppress that. You don't have to become a secular organization that never does anything religious. But in a government-funded, directly funded program, that cannot be part of it. You can't just say, well, you know, the official program starts at 10, but you better show up at 9:30 so we can have prayer together. Subterfuge like that, I think it was pretty clear it was not allowed.
I agree.
And the last question.
Hi, John Fornell with the Institute for Global Engagement. I appreciate that Mr. Kessler rose the issue concerning with the fourth part of the press release. With faith-based and neighborhood partnerships, deals with issues primarily on local, state, and federal partnerships with faith-based groups. But then there's this option of dialogue across foreign borders, especially with the National Security Council. Following with Mr. Kessler's question, how would this dialogue look? And we talked about dealing with crises in other nations, but how would this look with working with other nations in ensuring religious freedom for the sake of preserving the rule of law, security, and especially in the context of our Constitution, our First Amendment, whereas other nations may not have that guarantee?
Boy, I wish I could do justice to your question, and I'm afraid I can't. I have to plead not on that task force again. Ibu Patel, just a friend of mine who's on the council, is going to be on that task force, and I would just urge you to contact him. I could venture some general thoughts, but I'd just rather not, because you're obviously an expert working in this area, and I couldn't do justice to your question. But I do know that he is one person who will be on that task force and has done really great work in this area, and he's with Interfaith Youth Corps in Chicago, Illinois, so I just urge you to speak with him.
Let me add a word on this, and it's not about the dialogue point, about which I know less than Melissa, but it is about overseas programs. We do have some history with this, because we have programs run by USAID that involve overseas assistance typically for education and health. So we're helping hospitals and schools overseas, and sometimes we have American faith-based groups that are involved in delivering that aid or involved in those partnerships. And there's some very, very intricate and complicated constitutional questions about sort of the role of the Establishment Clause in overseas activities of the United States. For example, it would be unthinkable domestically to say, let's find the moderate Islamic leaders and give them money to teach moderate Islam in the United States as against other brands, right? This is just absolutely impermissible in our domestic constitutional tradition. But suppose we wanted to do this overseas. Suppose in Pakistan we said, let's support this madras, but not that madras because of the brand of Islam that's taught. You could imagine that, and I think the questions there are very interesting and very important.
I wanted to say something when this question first came up, that there's one other area that has not gotten enough attention, and that is every field has acronyms, faith-based organizations or FBOs, and I became fascinated with IFBOs, which are interfaith-based organizations, and this is on the point of dialogue. There are, in many communities, religious congregations, no single religious congregation is big enough to get a particular job done. Therefore, they ally with other congregations, often not of their own tradition, sometimes not of their own religion. And indeed, these kind of partnerships can also be partnerships between secular nonprofits and religious nonprofits. And I do hope more attention is paid to those possibilities, and particularly ones across the religious, non-religious divide. I mean, the whole point of what we're talking about is to solve problems and help people who need help. And it seems to me the question is, how do we solve problems effectively? How do we help people effectively within constitutional limits? We can have endless arguments and legitimate arguments about what those constitutional limits are. We should also have useful discussions about how to make these efforts effective across the lines of religious and secular.